Welcome to the Center for Sexual Assault Survivors presentation on understanding trauma and how the brain is impacted. We will be defining trauma and discussing how the brain works differently during and after a traumatic experience. This presentation is being provided by the Center for Sexual Assault Survivors. We provide free and confidential services to primary and secondary survivors of sexual violence. Our services include individual and support group counseling, advocacy, education and training, outreach, and awareness. We have a 24/7 crisis hotline where someone is always available to speak with and answer questions, no matter the time of day or night. Our agency serves the entire peninsula area, men, women, children, and other. When we're talking about understanding and defining trauma, we have to really think about what a traumatic event is. So, a traumatic event, either witnessed or experienced, representing a fundamental threat to one's physical integrity or survival. And one thing I want you to bold, underline, red print is either witness or experience. So, just because someone only saw the experience happening does not mean that they may not have some of the same responses and the same trauma triggers as well too. So that's very, very important to remember, especially for those bystanders, or even if, let's say, it was a sibling in the house or other people witnessed an assault happen at a party. They may very well have similar trauma responses that the person that actually experienced it did too. So responses involve intense fear, helplessness, or horror. The meaning of the event may be as important as the actual physical act or experience. So, for example, if a child is sexually assaulted by their dad, thinking they were raped because they were bad, they may grow up thinking they have to be a people pleaser. They cannot be bad, or something bad is going to happen to them. Or a spouse thinking that they're supposed to have sex with their partner regardless of if they consent to it or not. So they're attaching meaning to that event, and that may be, again, more important to that person than the actual physical act or experience too. That is something that's very, very important to remember. So trauma changes the way that your brain processes things. And with that, that can be a significant impact of the way that your brain processes it. May be delayed reporting, so not reporting to the police right after it happened, or not reporting at all to an extent, or the inability to recall those details and to remember what happened, or to remember at least in order of what happened. Those are very, very common impacts, and those can be lifelong. It may not just go away for people, or people may not magically just remember what happened to them. 9 times out of 10, those memories do not come back, or they may come back very, very slowly. So that's something to keep in mind too, that's a common reaction. And a lot of victims may think, why can't I remember something? Or if this is so significant, and I was so scared in that moment, I should be able to. And again, it was the brain's defense mechanism to say, no, this is too dangerous for you to remember. So traumatic memory is also stored in the brain differently. The impacts of trauma are frequently misinterpreted as not telling the truth or false reporting. So if a person is coming to an investigator and telling them that a sexual assault happened, and their story is all over the place about what time it happened, or where they were, or who they were with, or what the person said, or what they were wearing, that can come across as flighty, or as if they're trying to make up a story, when in reality, they're just trying to remember what happened in their best way possible. The victim's first impression matters. It really matters how the victim first interacts with someone after a trauma, because that can determine whether or not, that can actually determine the state of the brain. So if they feel like they're being threatened by the questions that they're being asked, or if they don't feel safe in that moment, that may make it a lot more difficult for them to remember what's going on. So us as advocates, we should be able to understand the impact of victim trauma, because that will also promote more victim healing, hopefully more reporting. And again, with reporting, that is always the victim's choice. We never make that decision for them. We also let them know that someone else, even though someone else may pressure them, cannot necessarily make that decision for them as an adult. Now, children, of course, are a different circumstance as far as reporting goes, but I did want to make that clear that for adults, if they have been sexually assaulted, it is their choice whether or not to report. So it also in the understanding the impact of victim trauma also promotes better interviews and investigations. So the investigators understanding how they speak to a victim will also likely help them figure out ways to get better responses and more accurate responses and ways to make the victim feel safer. And so that in turn should lead to greater offender accountability. So the more people that report, hopefully that gets more people off of the street, and that would also help with the public safety aspect. Now, on the other hand, not understanding leads to bad outcomes and potentially long-term devastating consequences for victim and the community. And with that, that's, that lack of feeling heard or feeling believed on the victim's part. And then also for the community aspect, there's that's where a lot of these common misconceptions come from, of that stranger in the alley or of these quote unquote false reports, because the victim is not being asked the questions appropriately or in a trauma informed way. So we have to think about these types of things in a broader scale to increase the understanding of how we can help both the victim and the community overall. Trauma changes our brain physically. So those changes also last. It's not something that just goes away after the traumatic experience is over. Our brain is physically changed after that, and it also affects the way that our stress levels work and what we perceive as dangerous even after the attack or after the assault. So we develop triggers, and even we may see things that was not a trigger to us before, or were not a trigger to us before, and then now we're looking at it and everything seems dangerous, or a lot of different things are changed because of what happened. These responses are automatic. People ask, why didn't they fight back? Why do I feel like this? Why have so many aspects of my life change? And that's literally because the body has made these decisions in order for survival. So the trauma triggers chemicals in our brain, those hormonal floods, the way that we respond. Those chemicals influence the perception, reaction, and memory. So how we perceive things, what we perceive as dangerous, how our body is going to respond in that moment. Those memories become fragmented, and the memory is stored in the brain differently. We do not remember things, traumatic things, the same way that we do remember things that are not traumatic. So we're probably going to be hypersensitive to those traumatic memories, but again, only those larger islands of memories are going to get encoded. We're not going to remember every single piece of it. And one of the biggest pieces for you all to remember and to take away from this is we do not control how the brain and body respond to trauma. So even with the fight, flight, or freeze, our body decides if it's going to flee or fight. So a lot of times, a victim will ask, why didn't I fight back? Why didn't I scream? Why didn't I tell someone? It's because your body decided in that moment, and your brain said, okay, this is what we need to do for survival. So again, we do not control how the brain and body respond to trauma. And that's something that is very important for survivors to understand, because it can take some of that guilt and blame away or off of themselves. It may not be an immediate, of course, cure or anything, but it is more of an understanding aspect of our brain decided that for us in order to survive. And whatever the brain decided, your body did not betray you, because you made it to this point and did survive the situation. The concept of fight or flight is misleading. So our brains are not wired to do this. They're not wired this way at all. So we are evolved to freeze first and then flee. So we always pause, no matter if that's for a couple seconds, if it's for longer than that, but we pause basically to give our brain is giving itself enough time to think about, okay, I'm in this situation. How am I going to get out? Am I able to get out? And so with that, if we don't feel like we can get out, that's when we fight. So fighting is only in the service of fleeing unless there's no other option. It's also important that victims understand this, because one of the number one things that we hear is, why didn't I fight back? And they have that shame. They have that guilt for thinking they can get out of the situation. But we fight because we're trying to escape, only if there's no other option. So fleeing, again, does not mean physical escape. This also includes mental escape. So sometimes we may dissociate or focus on something so that we're not in that moment. This is also important to explain to victims and their loved ones, or friends and family, because they may have some skewed expectations of how the victim should have reacted in the moment, when in reality, the brain decided for them. So, when speaking about the brain and its relation to trauma, specifically during sexual assault, the prefrontal cortex is all pieces of the brain work together, but the prefrontal cortex is very important to consider when thinking about trauma in the brain. So, the prefrontal cortex, it's what helps us manage emotions and reflect on our behaviors. It's the part of us, the brain that makes us human, and it manages other cognitive systems. So, it's kind of like that executive function. It allows us to focus our attention where we choose and do what we choose, consistent with our goals and values, and becomes impaired in traumatic situations. So it directly and indirectly influences other brain regions involved in stress, emotions, reflexive, and impulsive behaviors. The prefrontal cortex can easily become impaired or even shut down in traumatic situations. And when you think about that, if it is the management of all other brain regions and impacts every other thing that's going on with your brain, then that being shut down or that being changed in any type of way will have a significant impact on the victim and how they respond and what they do. The fear circuitry consists of these four components. The circuitries, they're connected brain areas that work together to perform tasks. So just like we just mentioned about the prefrontal cortex, it manages everything. So the entire brain works together to make sure that we function in a way that's quote unquote appropriate, or that we feel like we can it works together to manage our thoughts, feelings, reactions, behaviors, everything. That fear circuitry, the role is to receive all the information and answer the question, is this a threat? Am I in danger? What do I need to do to survive? Or do I have to kick into survival mode? So it's automatic and somewhat subconscious. So for example, we can see something that reminds us of our trauma and react. A trigger, you all may have heard that term a lot lately, like a perpetrator wearing a yellow sweater. And so if that perpetrator had a yellow sweater on during the time of the assault, now all yellow sweaters may trigger fear. And to us from the outside looking in, that may sound very, confusing, or we may have difficulty understanding it. But for our brain, that was what our brain focused on in the moment and said, oh my gosh, I'm in a bad situation. I need to get out of this. This is a threat to me. So the amygdala, that's the brain's fear center. It decodes emotion, it determines that possible threat, it stores fear memories, it determines what you pay attention to during trauma and triggers those emotional reflexes. So again, the perpetrator wearing a yellow shirt, the amygdala was saying, this is bad, this is danger. Every other person after that with a yellow shirt is a clear warning sign. The hippocampus, it stores and retrieves conscious memories and processes sets of stimuli to establish the context. So this helps us understand not necessarily how we got ourselves in that moment, but but after the fact, it is what is telling us how to put pieces together of remembering that part. So if we can't understand the context of it, for example, how the conversation started that may have led to going over the perpetrator's house, and the sexual assault occurring, just for example, that part is controlled by the hippocampus. The hypothalamus, that activates the response, sympathetic nervous system, the adrenal system, so that fight or flight response, which we will talk about a little bit later as well too. But this is the part that controls whether or not we decide to flee, or whether or not we feel it's okay enough for us to fight back in whatever way the brain decides. The pituitary gland, it controls the release of hormones. So during a traumatic event, there is usually a hormonal flood of all types of hormones. So it may be the happy emotions, the fear emotions, the everything that you can possibly think of is all happening at once. So that if there's an overload of that of course will impact the memory and how the victim responds in that moment as well. So all this talk about the brain, do we really understand what happens during a sexual assault? And just like we just mentioned, the hormonal flood that happens is very, very important to understand. So the hypothalamus notifies the pituitary gland. So again, all of these brain functions, they communicate with each other. So they notify each other that a traumatic attack is occurring. So that also lets the adrenal gland know that hormones need to be released in order to survive. So with that comes the hormonal flood. Natural adrenaline, the energy available whether that's depleted or increased. And most of the time, it is usually depleted, the energy, and then the natural morphine and the promotion of good feelings. So, a common example that I like to give is sometimes people laugh when they're nervous, when they feel nervous. Or even, we may have survivors that come to us and say, I had an orgasm as a result of or during the assault. That is a very common normal bodily function or bodily reaction. So with that, we like to explain to survivors that, all of this, again, they do not control how they react. This is the body's response, and all of these hormones are going on at one time. So adrenaline and cortisol, they help with the fight or flight response or freeze, because all of these chemicals are working together at the very same time. So this is very, very, very common. We always freeze before our body decides if it's going to flee or fight. So opioids and oxytocin are released to help provide sort of a numbing effect. It's also the reason why people often react very differently after trauma. So an example for that is some people will either kind of go on about their lives or maybe feel numb to it. And some people, we have that common misconception or the common understanding or stereotype of, if someone has been sexually assaulted, they're going to be crying, they're not going to be able to go to work, they won't be able to function. But that does not mean that. It just means that their reaction after may be different than another person during that traumatic moment. Or even, we've had some clients that have contacted the perpetrator after for various reasons. And in court, that may look weird because it's like, okay, if you said that you were fearful in that moment, if you felt like, this person was such a threat to you, why are you contacting? But again, that has to do with the hormonal flood and the brain's reaction and understanding of the situation. This is a very common quote and something that you may hear from time to time. So they didn't act like they had just been raped. So let's think of all of the different stereotypes or the different images or messages that we are sent out regularly or, on TV. Or if we read an article about how a sexual assault survivor acts after they have been raped, we typically think of someone crying, someone falling out, someone not being able to get themselves together, someone also probably knowing everything that happened or being able to remember every part of the incident. And so in reality, that looks completely different for each person. There is no set design of how a person acts after they have been assaulted. There is no set way to tell that someone is a victim or a survivor of sexual assault. And you really only know what the person tells you and what they can remember. And so I think it's very good to understand that this is a very common misconception and to think about what stereotypes we've been fed and what types of biases we may have, whether we know it or not, about thinking about what someone acts like after they had just been raped. There is no common formula or behavior that says that that's a standard. So when thinking about traumatic situations, specifically sexual assault, it's very important to consider drastic survival reflexes. So these survival reflexes, they occur when escape is or appears impossible. Again, appears. So it's more about the perception of what the survivor thinks. If they think that they can't get out of that situation, then their survival reflexes are going to kick in order to do what they have to do to survive until they can escape. So attempting to escape and survive when there is no physical escape, or like I said, no assumed physical escape. So for example, there may be a door in the room where the person is being assaulted, but the victim may not know whether or not that door is locked, how heavy the door is, if they can get past the perpetrator to even get out of that door. So at that moment, in the victim's mind, that escape is impossible. It's automatic survival reflexes, so the victim does not have control over what happens or how they respond in the moment, and that prefrontal cortex is impaired. That impacts the rational thought processes. So the fear circuitry may automatically determine that escape is impossible. We get so nervous, so scared, so frightened that we think that there is no possible way out. So of course, looking back later, the survivor or their prefrontal cortex actually may recognize that an escape was possible at the time. But what really matters, especially when the victim is coming to you explaining that, is that the fear circuitry concluded at that time that they were not in a safe enough position to leave. So the helping the victim understand that can help with their feelings of guilt and help with the questioning of, why didn't I do this? Why didn't I fight back? Why didn't I scream? But it's also important to let survivors know that they could not have controlled their response at all. It was up to the prefrontal cortex and how the brain thought how much it was in danger. So they did what they needed to do to survive. Some more survival reflexes in the body. These are all very common. And if you're looking at them, again, kind of at face value, these are things that we regularly may experience. Like say if we're working out, our heart might beat faster, blood pressure increases, breathing rate increases, that blood flow to the muscle increases, your pupils may dilate. But again, if you think about it, if you're exercising or doing something where you expect for these things to happen, you have more control over them happening. In a traumatic situation, you do not have control over all of these things happening at once, on top of trying to figure out how to survive. So all of these things allow us to do things we may not normally be able to do. Again, it kind of increases that hormonal flood. It increases sometimes our physical strength, so that we can survive what we perceive as life-threatening. Again, that perception. Some common drastic survival reflexes include disassociation, tonic immobility, and collapsed immobility. So disassociation, that includes the disconnections of awareness from emotions and even sensations in one's body. So it kind of feels like the victim is spaced out, disconnected, on autopilot. It feels like you or your situation are not real. So like you're in a fog or maybe a movie. Sometimes victims will describe that it feels like they're looking at themselves or looking at something happen to them. So it's literally that feeling of being disconnected from your body and just kind of going through the motions without feeling any sense of control or choice over that. Tonic immobility is different from freezing. So freezing is when movement is possible but not engaged in while you're assessing the situation. So the freezing part is just kind of that you're frozen for that moment before you react. But tonic immobility, it's composed, or a part of that is the freezing, but completely it is the inability to move or speak or cry out even if you want to. An extreme version of shutting down. So I always like to compare this to sleep paralysis, where a lot of people have experienced it, where you're asleep or you're laying down but you feel completely awake, or you can see everything in front of you but you cannot move. You can hear, you can feel it, you can see it, but you can't move to react. And so you literally feel paralyzed. And so some people will say that during sleep paralysis they see like a figure or something in another part of the room, which can be very similar to the feeling of, or that same feeling of tonic immobility during an assault, that paralyzed feeling, seeing something that is frightening to you and you can't do anything to react. So tonic immobility is caused by extreme fear, physical contact with the perpetrator, restraint, and perception of inescapability. So again, back to that perception, that assumption that you cannot escape, even if physically you may actually be able to. It's what your brain tells yourself. So collapsed immobility, on the other hand, it causes the muscle tone to be lost and your body may go limp. So with that, there's that decrease in heart rate and blood pressure, faintness, quote unquote sleepiness. You're feeling like you're kind of going in and out of consciousness. Some people completely lose consciousness. And of course, like I mentioned, losing the muscle tone as well too. So all of these are brain-based. They are all normal. They're all automatic responses. You do not need to know these technical terms. If someone is calling the hotline, we do not expect you to say that you couldn't move because you had tonic immobility or collapsed immobility. We just want you to know how to understand what they mean and what that looks like. So whatever the victim did in that moment is the reason why they're here. So this describes disassociation kind of to a T. It was silence, looking at her through a glass wall, so it couldn't affect me, couldn't touch me. So not fully feeling like, they were even there, or seeming as if the experience is just looking at themselves, like it says, through a glass wall, but not being able to be fully in the moment or not being able to recognize, just separating yourself from the situation. So that's definitely an example, a good quote for disassociation. So these brain-based counterintuitive behaviors are four major responses that lead people to doubt that the person was actually sexually assaulted. But in reality, these are all very normal and very common responses. So imagine, telling someone that the victim did not resist, they didn't scream, they did not attempt to leave, to escape, to get out of the situation, and that it seemed like they were a quote unquote active participant. From someone on the outside looking in, that looks like they wanted it to happen or that they consented because they didn't resist or scream or try to get someone else's attention or try to leave, or even the tonic immobility or the collapsed immobility of kind of just laying there. And to someone else, it might look like they just let it happen or they wanted it to happen. But these are literally brain-based counterintuitive behaviors. So your brain decided in that moment that this is how you're going to respond to make sure that you get through it. This does not mean that this person gave consent. It's literally because the brain decided for you, this is how we're going to survive at this time. One of the main ways that trauma affects the brain during a sexual assault is memory. So, what this module will cover will discuss the way that trauma impacts the brain and how the memory is affected. During a sexual assault, there is a sense of memory consolidation. So the hippocampus, it's a part of the brain that processes information into memories. It decides what memories are going to go where, what we are going to remember, what we're not. And the amygdala specifically specializes in the processing of emotional memory. So these two work together. They're both very sensitive to hormone fluctuations. Hippocampus is altered, the context is poorly woven, the sequence of events is poorly encoded. So the person may not remember the time frame of events, how long something took to happen, or what occurred around them during that time, or even how the conversation was started in the first two. So these two work together to figure out or to compose the memories or get rid of memories. There's a significant increase in the stress hormones, and so that's the impaired functioning in the hippocampus. Our memories become fragmented. That memory recall can be slow, difficult, or not at all. So a lot of times people will wonder and ask, why don't I remember anything? Why can't I remember this specific part? What we do remember is the part of the assault when we first remembered that we were in a dangerous situation. We first realized that this was a bad situation to be in, and that we were in survival mode. So those fragments of memories, we call them islands, are the important pieces of it. Those are kind of burned into our brain based on those stress hormones and the fact that the hippocampus is impaired. So, what gets encoded into the memory during a sexual assault and during that traumatic experience? There's fragments of experience that are burned in. And, like I mentioned before, we call them islands of memory. So, memories of sexual assault tend to be fragmentary images, sounds, and body and other sensations. So we remember those strong smells, those strong sounds, those strong feelings of how our body felt in that moment, as well as the strong emotions like disgust and horror, of course, fear. And this is how things trigger us. So there's few peripheral details because those were things that were given little attention or memory encoding resources. So little or no time sequence information, little or no words or narratives, especially soon after the trauma and early in the recovery. And that's what, like I mentioned, helps us develop those triggers. So, a person may feel like the assault occurred for hours when in reality it lasted for 5 to 10 minutes. And that's very difficult for the brain to understand in that moment or even after, because the way that the brain remembers it is based on how it felt in the moment, again, of survival, too. With these islands of memory, there are micro islands and there are larger islands. So the micro islands are those fragmentary sensations, again, those feelings that are triggered, or the things that we remember of, like I said, the feelings, the sounds, the smells, those sensations that were very pertinent at the moment. The larger islands are the key periods within the assault. So when the fear kicked in, right before and after, those big moments that are basically burned in, again, like we mentioned before. So the survival reflexes, I know we've discussed some of these indicators of non-consent. And if you think about the definition of all of these, freezing, disassociation, tonic immobility, collapsed immobility, these all don't look like non-consensual behaviors, or it doesn't look like the person is not consenting. It sometimes can look like they're going along with it, because if they're frozen or if they're disassociated and kind of spaced out and not there, they're not fighting back in that moment. So, and then tonic immobility, if they're out of it or completely lost conscious, that's the collapse immobility, I'm sorry. But during tonic immobility, if they're frozen or paralyzed and they can see everything that's going on but can't physically react, and even the collapsed immobility, that loss of consciousness or completely being drained of the energy, either way, they're not responding. So those are indicators of non-consent and those survival reflexes that the brain decides for us. So one thing I want you to think about is all of the memory concerns and difficulties that we've discussed up to this point have been without the introduction of alcohol and drugs. So imagine bringing that into the mix and how that further impairs your memory or impacts what types of things get burned in as well. So even, without a traumatic incident happening, sometimes a person may go out and drink and they're not going to remember every single thing that happened while they were out drinking or while they were under the influence of drugs. So you introduce trauma into that, and let's say there's a low or moderate dose of intoxication, their ability to encode the context of the situation is impaired. But this does not impair the coding of sensation. So again, those sounds, those smells, those feelings, they still get encoded. You may remember them. You may not remember necessarily, again, the context of how it happened or when it happened or what specifically happened. You probably will just remember the actual feeling of it happening. And so that resembles the effect of fear or trauma, of course, because it's based on what happened from the trauma. The high dose of intoxication that impairs both the context and the sensations. So in a severe blackout, nothing gets encoded, meaning the person has no memory whatsoever of what happened. We have had some people that will either call the hotline, or we've met them at the hospital or have come to us for services, and they'll say to us, I don't remember anything that happened. I just woke up and I felt different. I felt weird. I felt like something had happened to me, or, I felt like my body was different. And we always let people know to trust your gut, to go with that feeling, because even if you do not remember, a lot of times an assault may have occurred or a traumatic incident did occur, and it's best to get that checked out rather than to ignore it, and something may be bigger out of it as well too. So we always support the decisions of the victim or the survivor if they are wondering whether or not something happened but they don't remember it either. So it's their choice of what their next step is with that too. But just to think about introducing alcohol and drugs further impairs the memory. Remembering the experience and retelling what happened to a victim can be very difficult. So trying to put those memories and that experience into words is impacted really by the state of the brain when they're trying to tell their story. So the state of the brain affects what can be retrieved and put into words. So if they feel unsafe when they're being questioned, if they feel that they're being judged or they're being blamed, so some of those victim blaming questions that may be asked, which may not be the intention of the investigator or even of the advocate, or, we wouldn't be asking these types of questions, but, how much did you have to drink? What were you wearing? Why did you go out there to meet with this person in the first place? That can make a person feel unsafe, and they may feel like they're right back within that moment of the assault happening again. And so they may not be able to appropriately use their prefrontal cortex to get those rational thoughts and to get those memories back and to even understand what is being asked of them and what they're being asked to tell. So if they feel traumatized by the questioning, this may trigger that bottom-up retrieval. So again, their attention is focused on what is making them fearful and that survival mechanism again too. So the fragmentary sensations, those emotions that came up, and it could really almost be as intense as the assault happening itself. There have been, times that a victim may be on the stand at court and tell their story of what happened, whether it's in front of a judge or also in front of a jury and their peers and everything. And they can become it can become very difficult to recall the story or to calm themselves down and be able to express what happened because of how they're being asked to. So even under the best of conditions, someone who has been assaulted is likely to have a hard time putting those fragments and those sensations and emotions that they can remember into words, so let alone into a coherent story. It may be very difficult for us to understand or put it together, but so that's why it's very important that we're patient and that we also let the survivor know that we believe them and that we know that this may be a difficult time and difficult to piece together. So just being patient and reminding them to be patient with themselves as well. This brings us to the end of the presentation. So this slide has all of our contact information, and if you have any questions, would like support, and or need any additional information, please contact the center at any time. Thank you.